Yes.
Okay.
Hi everybody, this is Christina from Access Princeton. And today we are speaking with Stacey Geurds of the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office. Stacey is the Chief Assistant Prosecutor for Domestic Violence. And since last month was Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we met with Heidi from Women's Space, we decided to take this month and we're going to talk to Stacey about what qualifies as domestic violence. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate it.
Well, we wanted to talk about what is domestic violence in New Jersey. A lot of people historically think about it applying to husbands and wives, and that's absolutely true. I'm going to refer to my chart here. Domestic violence relationships apply to a lot more than just husbands and wives. So it includes a defendant who is a spouse, a former spouse, a defendant as a household member, or was at any time a household member. So this kind of relationship can include college dorm mates and roommates who just get together to pool their resources. Also, if a defendant has had a dating relationship with a victim, a present relationship, or a prior relationship. Additionally, if the defendant has a child in common with the victim, or the defendant anticipates having a child because the victim or the defendant is pregnant. Right? So those are the necessary relationships in order for the domestic violence statute to apply. And then, once you have that necessary relationship, you also need to have one of the domestic violence crimes or offenses applied. Now, just in August, the legislature added 3 additional statutes. We used to have 14, now we have 17. They range from homicide, assault, terroristic threats, stalking, kidnapping, criminal restraint, false imprisonment, criminal coercion, contempt, sex assault, criminal sexual contact, lewdness, criminal mischief, burglary, criminal trespass, harassment, and robbery. And the legislature put into effect a category that says any other crime in addition to those 17 that involves the risk of death or serious bodily injury to a person who is a protected person. One of those people that we talked about having that necessary relationship. So in New Jersey, if you have that relationship, if you have one of those crimes or offenses, and you feel you have the need for a restraining order, you need the protections of a restraining order, you can make that application 24 hours a day, anywhere you are. You can go to your police department if it's after court hours, or during court hours, you go to the family court in Trenton. You make that application, and a judge has to make an assessment of whether or not it's applicable, whether or not you should get a restraining order or not. And that assessment is made only on the victim's testimony, swearing to tell the truth before the judge, and the court makes an assessment, the judge or a hearing officer. And then within about 10 days, there's a final hearing where the defendant, after he has notice of the allegation, gets a chance to put forth his or her story about why perhaps a restraining order isn't necessary in this particular case. So that's essentially who can qualify for a domestic violence restraining order. And similarly, when you're prosecuting a domestic violence offense criminally, the same things have to apply. So there can be a dual track. You can have a request for a restraining order, and the underlying offense or crime could be the very thing that you're prosecuting criminally. 2 different tracks, each having their own burdens. The burden that I deal with in proving is the criminal track, and then there's the civil track of the restraining order, which is up to the victim plaintiff to prove the case. In the civil cases, the victim can be represented, and so can the defendant, or they can proceed on their own. Criminally, the victim is not represented by me, but it's the state's case against the defendant, and the victim is my witness in the case. So the state has an interest in prosecuting the case to protect not only that victim particularly, and perhaps that victim's children, but also society at large in an effort to try to prevent domestic violence. Domestic violence is difficult because of the personal nature of the relationships. So victims often have conflicts about prosecuting someone who they love, someone who a woman or a man may love and have an intimate relationship with. And it's understandable, because I never suggest that everything about that defendant is bad. I'm not suggesting he or she's a bad person, but I do suggest that we have to hold defendants responsible for domestic violence. Simply because it happens in the privacy of a home or the privacy of a car doesn't mean that society shouldn't care about the violence. particularly in how it impacts children who are seeing the violence occur and who are developing their own relationships based upon what they are learning from mom and dad, whether or not the abuse, whichever way it's happening, from mom to dad or dad to mom. There are victims who are men, that goes without saying. Domestic violence is an equal opportunity offender, but primarily we see a lot more men engaging in the violence. But like I said, it goes without saying that women are prosecuted as well. Everyone has a right to defend him or herself and use reasonable force in defending him or herself, but you cannot go beyond that. So the law protects people, but it requires them to act reasonably with respect to self-defense.
One of the questions that just came through is, isn't that why many states are taking over the rights to press charges?
Well, we are one of those, in that domestic violence is a mandatory arrest situation when four circumstances exist: when the police officers see signs of violence, when a weapon's involved, when there's a restraining order in place, or when the defendant already has warrants for his arrest. So in those four cases, the citizen, victim, doesn't have a choice in participating in whether or not the defendant's charged. The police officers shall arrest the defendant. And while we certainly get the victim involved early on, and we want to know the victim's feelings about what's an appropriate prosecution, we will sometimes go ahead with the prosecution despite the victim's request not to, because objectively we see that the victim faces danger and we have concerns about that. So many of our cases involve probation with no jail, and force the defendant to get into some domestic violence counseling, force the defendant to undergo an evaluation to see if he or she has a drug or alcohol problem, force the defendant to engage in some community service, and maybe to keep a job, get a job and keep a job, those kinds of things. Sometimes a mental health evaluation is necessary. The drinking and the drugs and the mental health evaluation, those issues never cause domestic violence, because domestic violence is a separate attribute that someone can have engage in, because there are plenty of people who can get drunk and do drugs and they're not violent. So it's a separate issue that needs to be addressed with the domestic violence counseling. And then there are cases which involve the punishment of jail and or prison. And like I said, we certainly take into account the victim's feedback. The victims have their own rights, the Victim's Bill of Rights, and we honor those rights. But sometimes there are certain victims who don't even understand objectively how dangerous the situation has become for them. So there's a chart that we have provided to police officers and probation workers all over the state, actually, which talks about some of the lethality assessment factors. Some of these factors that are listed here are here because in domestic violence homicides, we have studied them and we have done a look back to see what were the common factors in those cases. And we do that so that we can help predict future lethality. We certainly don't want to keep somebody in a relationship where we know objectively that person is in great danger. Some of those factors are that the defendant has access to weapons, especially guns. The defendant has threatened to use the weapon. There's a recent separation, or the victim has threatened to leave. Oftentimes, that's the most dangerous time for the victim, when the victim is trying to leave the relationship. The defendant then loses the power, starts to feel a little out of control, and needs to regain that control again. Also, if the defendant abuses alcohol and or drugs, rage towards police, if I can't have you, no one can kind of mentality, that is very much out there. That's just not on TV when people say that.
Just to interrupt real quick, somebody wanted to know, if they get arrested for domestic violence, don't they lose their rights to their guns?
Yes, they do.
And to respond to Noah, Stacey from the Mercer County Prosecutor's Office, not from the police department.
Yes.
I had asked that.
So we work together with the police, but essentially the police are investigating all of these cases, and once the police are done their investigation, the complaints and the reports come to us, we review them, decide what court is appropriate for jurisdictionally speaking, and then we prosecute them. And the detectives I have in my unit then I will ask them to do follow-up work. So if I see something that the police did, but I want to follow up a little bit more and find out what more a certain witness knew, then my detectives will go out and gather that information for me.
And I just have a question. You've been doing this a long time.
Yes.
How has it changed over the years?
Riding here, I was thinking, I've been 17 and a half years as a prosecutor. When I first started, people used to threaten, used to wave a knife, used to wave an object, a deadly weapon, and threaten it. I have found more and more people are actually stabbing. They're actually shooting. No longer are they just threatening without following through. And it's almost as if the stabbing and the shooting is done in some sort of feeling like, well, it's just a TV show. It will all go away afterwards, without any recognition of the harm that's occurring, not just to the victim, but to the children who are present and seeing this violence. That, in my career, two significant concerns: the seriousness of strangulation in domestic violence cases and the impact of domestic violence on children. People do not understand that these little ones are watching, are hearing. That's how they are learning how to have relationships. And it's a serious injustice when we are ignoring the children in a DV relationship. And oftentimes a victim and a defendant will say, well, the children were in bed, they didn't hear anything. That's not the case. The children are very savvy and they listen, and I train police officers to talk to the children, ask the children, what did you see? What did you hear? Are you afraid? Know that we will come back every time you call 911. And part of the evidence collection that we do in DV cases is get the 911 calls. I have heard such hideous 911 calls by children calling in to report that daddy is hurting mommy. I mean, it will bring you to tears. I don't care who you are. And that kind of evidence, to me, is crucial in our case, but beyond the evidence, it shows that we need to pay attention to these children. They are seeing, they are hearing.
Right. Somebody made a comment and said that they're desensitized to these things because they're just happening so frequently.
People generally speaking?
Yeah.
Sure, but I think that it used to be that 50% of domestic violence went unreported, so that criminally we were only dealing with 50%. I have a feeling that because domestic violence is more spoken about, more publicized, we are getting into that other 50% that wasn't reported. But rest assured, in every single jurisdiction in this county, in this state, across this country, there is domestic violence happening. I mean, we've seen it in the sports industry. We've seen athletes committing domestic violence, and as a result, now we have some good infomercials or commercials during sports events, and that's wonderful. But domestic violence is happening everywhere, and there's still a stigma attached to it. No one wants to be a victim, certainly, and no one wants to be a defendant. Yeah. And sometimes defendants simply don't acknowledge their actions as being unlawful.
And now, just one last thing, we're using social media to do this.
Yes.
Do you feel social media has played a part in the growing reports of domestic violence?
Sure. I think people, although sometimes some of the things I see posted on some social media where the violence is kind of laughed at, I don't understand that. I really don't understand that, because violence at any level shouldn't be funny.
Right.
It's not funny.
Right.
And children watching it's not funny.
Right.
I mean, maybe adults can handle the sophistication of understanding that, but I don't think children can. And the public needs to hold each other accountable for violence. I'm not suggesting that the public get in the way of when you see something happening, but certainly to call the police. That is necessary. Calling 911 to make sure that that defendant is held accountable and that the victim can be safe. That's very critical.
Music Man just asked, what about the women who report false acts?
We have that occur. We absolutely have that occur when victims generally speaking, if they report, and we have evidence to indicate that it is a false report, we have charged victims with falsifying reports, because any time that's taken away from DV cases inappropriate, not to mention unlawful. So we cannot have resources diverted simply because a victim is angry at her boyfriend. We do not prosecute, however, when victims recant. If we still believe the incident occurred, and victims are what we call recanting, they are changing their minds about going forward with the prosecution, or they're minimizing being shot in the leg. They're minimizing having their ribs broken. We will not charge. We try to get those victims help through Women's Space. As you mentioned, you had Heidi come in. We tried to get those women some help so that they can understand the seriousness of the danger that they're in.
Stephen in Vermont said thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Had another comment as how can you break free of the emotional abuse?
Well, it's hard. It is very difficult, and that's only done through counseling. And I'm not talking about just once a week you show up and in an hour it's taken care of, because these are all learned behaviors. And let me just say one thing too. The defendant learns how to be an abuser. And a victim doesn't start off with a low self-esteem. People always say that. Well, she has a low self-esteem, that's why she's staying with the defendant. That's not it at all. In my experience, I have seen tremendously intelligent women and men, successful, who love themselves initially, get involved with an abuser who little by little, it's like a leaky faucet, right? One drip every now and then, but if you put a bucket under there, that faucet, little by little that accumulates, and before you know it, that bucket is overflowing. And oftentimes it's at that point that a victim thinks, how am I here? How did this happen? But a relationship evolves, and it doesn't start off with a defendant punching the victim in the nose and breaking her nose. If that happened on the first date, clearly, right, we wouldn't have a second date. That's not the way it happens. Defendants, abusers are very manipulative, and they're very charming. And so they can actually do pretty well for about 6 months or a year. And so by that time, a victim becomes invested into that relationship. And a victim sometimes thinks, well, if only I do this, he won't do that. That kind of thinking takes place. And it's difficult to get out of. I have found victims are very optimistic and forgiving. And those are very wonderful attributes to have as a human being. But they're also attributes that can be taken, abused by a manipulating individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of comments on that, and very good work that everybody is
Thank you.
Appreciating all the information they're getting. Is there anything else you want to add, or if anybody else has any more questions for Stacey? Because I know this has been a lot of information, and we went on for a little bit of time. But I really appreciate you taking the time to be in here. Blessings that Anne struggled with not being treated for being a victim. I guess sometimes the victims are stigmatized, as you mentioned earlier, so that becomes a problem.
Yes.
Down the line.
Yes, but counseling is available at Women's Space, group counseling and one-on-one counseling. It is excellent. It's an excellent resource. And with that treatment, you know, victims can understand that they deserve to be in a healthier relationship. They deserve that. So when they decide to leave, is up to them. They have to be safe. They have to have a safety plan in place before it's appropriate. And we need to stop asking, why doesn't the victim leave? And we need to start asking, why does the defendant or abuser continue to do what he or she is doing?
Right. And one thing I'd like to add is don't be afraid to call 911.
Absolutely.
You know, coming from the police end of things, I know that it's very important to not be afraid to call 911. The dispatchers are trained to handle these calls appropriately, and they will get you the help that you need.
Absolutely. And if you're a bystander, call 911.
Yes. All right. Great. Stacey, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will be reposting this so that you can watch it again, and have a good day.
Thank you.